one of his reviews in the Southern Literary Messenger, he advised an author to shoot himself. He also called the most popular novelist in the country, Washington Irving, the most overrated writer in America. He said that James Fenimore Cooper couldn't understand plot, didn't know how to write. He said that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the most popular poet in America, was a quack followed by a legion of literary quackery who had no original ideas, but did a fairly good job of stealing Poe's ideas.
Very dreadfully nervous I had been. But why will you say that I am mad? Hearken, and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story.
So by the time Poe's mother got pregnant with Poe's little sister, the father took off, was never heard from again. Left her to fend for herself and her 3 children, and then she contracted tuberculosis. And while she was dying in Richmond, her acting troupe advertised in the paper they needed some local ladies, some humane hearts, to come and take care of her. And Mrs. Allen was one of the ladies who started taking care of Mrs. Poe, and she agreed to take in little Eddie. Now, she couldn't have any children, so she lavished all of her attention on little Edgar. Meanwhile, her husband, John Allen, a wealthy tobacco exporter, could have children, was already having children with different women around town, already paying for them to go through school, getting them clothes, getting them books, trying to keep them secret from his wife. He actually includes 2 children in his will he says never even seen before, but some ladies said they're his, so they deserve something. But Edgar was never included in the will. From Mr. Allen's letters, we hear him calling Edgar that devil actress's son. He complains that Edgar is sulky, sullen, ill-tempered, disrespectful, doesn't show a spark of gratitude for all the charity I've shown him all those years. There's just not one good thing about that boy. The first thing he did was look out for his widowed aunt Mariah Clem and her daughter Virginia. And he moved the 2 of them in with him in Richmond, and he married his cousin. At the time, Edgar was still 27 years old. His wife was 13. It wasn't illegal back then. It wasn't absolutely unheard of. You can't do that today, though. But at first he thought of her like a little kid's sister. He called her Sissy. And there's a letter he wrote to her. He calls her my little Sissy, my darling cousin, and my little wifey. But his mother-in-law and his wife became this whole new family that supported him. And they say at night, he loved his wife. She would play the piano and he would play the flute. And his mother-in-law, he called Muddy, would sing along. They have little concerts together while he's writing stories about plucking out your wife's teeth or chopping up your wife and hiding her in the basement. He actually really did love his wife. But she also suffered from tuberculosis. One night when she was singing the piano, she started coughing up blood. And they realized that she wasn't going to last much longer. And at times, she would get better, and he thought she was cured. But then she'd get worse, and he said she was about to die, and he prepared for her funeral. Then she'd get better again. He thought she was cured, and then she'd get worse again. He said it felt like she was dying over and over again. He said of those years of her illness, I became insane with long intervals of horrible sanity. So he would have preferred insanity to the sanity of seeing what his wife was going through. It was just devastating, had a very dramatic effect on him. His health suffered after death. He'd only lived for another 2 years after she died. Well, Poe died when he was just 40 years old, at the height of his fame. His most recent works included The Bells and Annabel Lee and El Dorado. He was really at the top of his form. He was on a lecture tour, touring the country, and he'd finally reunited with his teenage sweetheart, Elmira. He was engaged to her when he was 16 years old. Her father had broken off the engagement, but now at 40, they had renewed their engagement. They were planning on getting married, and he was going to move back to Richmond. But before that could take place, he had a business trip to Philadelphia. He took the steamship from Richmond to Baltimore and then disappeared for 5 days. When he was found, he was at a polling place on a voting day, the Ryan's 4th Ward polls, semi-conscious and dressed in somebody else's clothes. It looks like somebody had beaten him and stolen his clothes. They were real cheap, ill-fitting rags, nothing like the kind of things he would have worn. One theory is that since he was found at a polling place on a voting day, is that he was a victim of cooping, and that's the practice by which ruffians would take people who just got off the ship that nobody recognized and drugging them, beating them, using them as repeat voters, just changing their clothes each time and dragging them from one polling place to the next. Now, he was taken from there to the hospital, where he spent 4 days. He was delirious. He was in and out of consciousness, talking to shadows on the wall. But he died 10 days before he would have married Elmira. His new poem, Annabel Lee, he'd intended to publish with his wedding announcement, first appeared at the end of his obituary instead.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door.
Poe's biography was always part of his appeal. He was sort of like the James Dean of literature. He was the American Lord Byron, the man who was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. So his face pops up everywhere. It's even been on a Beatles album cover. He's been a character on South Park. He's appeared on The Simpsons. Even The Raven was adapted in the first Treehouse of Terror episode.
Hey, Poindexter, it's Halloween. Put the book away.
For your information, I'm about to read you a classic tale of terror by Edgar Allan Poe.
Wait.
But Poe just keeps staying relevant because each generation is able to reinvent him, reinventing and reinterpreting not only Poe's works, but also who Poe is. He's a very modern seeming person. He's an outsider, doesn't seem to fit in. And that appeals to a lot of people, especially to students who feel that they don't quite fit in. They're trying to find their place in the world. They're trying to find how they make a mark. And that's something Poe is doing. He's always striving to find his place in the world. So in addition to just inspiring themes in other writers and artists' works, he's also influenced what it meant to be an artist, what it meant to be a poet, and what art meant, that art no longer had to teach you something, no longer had to edify you, that art could exist solely to entertain, solely to make you feel something. And that was one of his greatest contributions, and it's so huge a contribution to world art and literature that sometimes we don't even notice it.